planned, and I'll hand it over to Melinda Clem, Vice President of Strategy for Afilias, and let her take it from there.
Thanks, Dustin. Hi, everyone. We have had an extremely busy fall as a community with multiple meetings going on, both ICANN, the Internet Governance Forum, other regional IGF meetings, and of course, the big one, the multi-week Plenipot. Today we've got a great panel with some very informed opinions on each one of those. We've got people that have attended those, and they're going to give a readout on what some of the key takeaways that they've found over the last 2 months, and then we're going to have a brief Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. We'll start with Jane Coffin. So we've got Jane from the Internet Society.
And shout out to the chapter for having this event. I'll start with the Plenipotentiary event in Dubai, and I would be remiss if I didn't recognize our key colleague, who is our team leader, Elizabeth Ulowak, in the back, and Judith, who was our fellow on the delegation, who was an enormous help, and it was a great team on the ground. And of course, Andrew was there as well, but the fellows from the chapters were invaluable to the work we were doing. It was probably, I believe, the hardest plenipotentiary I've been to, and I've been to 6 now that I look back on it. It's a little scary. Becky was my boss when I first went to the first plenipotentiary in 1998, and I knew nothing about ICANN. Well, I knew Becky knew more about ICANN. I was doing development work, and I was at the plenipotentiary, and that's where the French government came in with changes to a resolution that would have said that the ITU should help regulate the interwebs, largely through ICANN being part of the ITU. So I'm seeing history repeat itself a little bit, so it's not surprising to see what happened also at the IGF, and I won't talk about that, but let others. But there's resonance here between the issues related to government, industry, and the internet community, and how we may need to start rebooting how we work together across different sectors. So part of what I was doing at the Plenipotentiary was looking at some of the development issues, which was highly well coordinated through CTEL with a resolution that came in on new actors, or AKA community networks. So we were really excited to see the great work in the CTEL region on this resolution, but it became what I call the beach ball, or the thing that got bounced around the plenipotentiary room, and it was the shiny object that got tromped on. So literally what we were so excited about, because the ISOC, we're doing lots of work on community networks, it's one of the things I work on, and it was shocking to me to see some of the fight on the floor against development and against access and building out the internet more and more, and or access networks. And so what became very clear is that it wasn't about development and whether or not they care about it, because many countries still do, of course. It became which issue was going to be most paramount. Was it cybersecurity or the internet issues or AI or OTT? And Elizabeth and I were comparing notes. Clearly cybersecurity was the pinnacle. And that's what most governments were going after. And I would just posit to the room, and it's something that the panel can think about too, is that some countries don't have a Five Eyes coalition. And so if you're looking at this as a developing country, where do you go to have your coalition? And clearly the ITU for some is that place. And so that was one thing I was taking away. And we thought we might get a glimmer of community networks surviving somewhere in one of the resolutions, and it did not. So we have a lot of work to do moving forward on the access issues, on community networks. And what I sort of take away from this as well, went to the IGF, where we had 3 or 4 panels on community networks, how to invest in them, how to scale, and we were talking about spectrum, so we were bringing tech back to the IGF as well. We had a great meeting there with community networks and talked to many people from around the world about the importance of building them and funding them and scaling them. So now we have to take a step back and think, where do we work together across the internet community, across business, and with governments? We've actually gotten some phone calls in the last couple of days from friendly governments, from Canada to Brazil to others, saying, how can we work with you? So this is a great opportunity. So I'm trying to make lemonade out of lemons in some ways, because we just had a call this morning too on an internet collaboration group where we decided that there are things we need to do to work together more, to educate governments, to work with the private sector, and as the internet community of interest to see what we can do to help build some of this infrastructure more and more, but figure out what we can do together.
It's on. Thanks. I'm Becky Burr. I'm a Chief Privacy Officer at Neustar. I'm on the ICANN board. I'm speaking for myself. I told Jane, she's told me this was about Plenipot, and I said, I cannot speak about Plenipot. I was not there. And she said, yes, you were. It was 1998. So that's a really terrifying concept, which I got calls from folks in the Vice President's office asking me why people were drinking Kool-Aid. It wasn't Jane. No, I was asking Jane that question. Stop her. I was at IGF, and for those of stop her. I was at IGF, and for those of you who are at IGF, it was a very odd experience. Partly because the space was very broken up, and it felt very segmented and sort of siloed in some ways. So, and that was a funny vibe, which I think is kind of a symbolic of, I came away from that feeling like we need to think about a more kind of cohesive message, working together. What is it? We need to be working better with the different parts of the groups that go into putting together the IGF, so that people come out feeling like they've been part of a whole conversation as opposed to sort of separate, isolated conversations. IGF is obviously a very important function for ICANN. We strongly support it and want to make sure that it's vibrant, that it's meeting the needs of the various stakeholders in it. We, of course, were all very focused on Macron's speech and what it meant, and what it meant that ISOC was supporting it, and what it meant that everybody else was supporting it, and what it meant going forward and for IGF 2019. And I think that my message is very similar to Jane's message, which is, we need to come together as a community to think about how to have better answers for various parts, which does not mean IGF is the solution for all things, or Plenipot is the solution for all things, or ICANN is the solution for all things, but that we're communicating better in a way about sort of how we work together across the entire ecosystem. So I think I'll stop there and let my comments go to questions.
Hi, I'm Gus. I'm with Public Knowledge. It was my first Plenipot, and I'm happy to say I did have some fun there. It was an interesting experience. I want to talk a bit about the role of civil society in a multilateral environment like the Plenipot. I think that we had organizations from around the world participating in national delegations from Mexico to Argentina, then going to the UK, and also organizations from Africa and other parts of Latin America. And I think that the fact that organizations manage to be effective in moving national delegations in a certain direction, it's a sign that civil society can play a role, but to play that role, it takes a lot of time. And I think that that's something that it was clear for me in Plenipot, that there is a blueprint for effective participation of civil society in multilateral environments, which, to be clear, doesn't mean that makes them multi-stakeholder environments, or that eliminates all the concerns that we have about internet governance decisions being taken in these kind of forums. But it shows that if we act together, and if we do our homework, if we prepare, if we coordinate, if we make the effort of engaging in a constructive way with governments, we can actually shape some positions, including on the ground. I mean, I think that the best outcomes came from actually engaging with delegations for years before the Plenipot. We saw the example how someone from Article 19 was taking the microphone for the European delegation to talk about the Europeans' positions on privacy. That's highly unusual. And that shows that things were done well. We also saw how the European delegation came out of its way to defend the position of the Americans on community networks. That was because of civil society coordination and effort to a large extent. And that's also unusual in multilateral environments. But I think that's a positive outcome. It's a positive lesson. And I think that that together with the efforts of ISOC and other groups, we can use this as a positive lesson for future endeavors. On a less happy note, I was really not surprised, but I was afraid that what I was going to see in Dubai was a stark divide between the so-called East and West, for lack of a better term. And we did see that, in which there is clearly an alignment between the Americas and Europe and Australia and New Zealand and a handful of other countries regarding how we see the role of states in internet governance, what we understand it is privacy, what's freedom of expression, and the rest of the world. And that makes it very hard to govern an institution like the ITU that represents all countries. That also shows the fact that we have this stark division shows that that the model that we have right now isn't enough. That at some point we need to be able to come up with something more propositive than just stopping institutions from doing things. That's a losing proposition. But what made me even more worried is that after Dubai, I went to Berlin for the Freedom Online Coalition, which is a conference of in theory like-minded countries that defend same values in multilateral environments and for internet governance. What I was surprised to see there is that, in my understanding, is that clearly the Europeans are developing, I think, their own model of internet governance. Like Becky was saying, that's what Macron outlined in Paris. That there's a great paper from the Global Public Policy Institute, a think tank in Berlin, detailing the theory behind it. And we don't have anything like that in this side of the Atlantic. We know that that's not what we want. We know that the Chinese model is not the model that we want. But what do we have to offer? And I think that's something that we should start thinking out loud and debating, because if we don't come up with a better alternative, then we might find that people are moving and we're stay back on alone.
Hi, everybody. My name is Susan Chalmers, and I work in the Office of International Affairs at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce. That's a mouthful. On behalf of NTIA, I do all things IGF, and so I did attend the IGF this year along with the head of our office, Fiona Alexander, and our assistant secretary, David Rettel. And I think that probably the biggest takeaway that I have from the IGF this year is with regards to government participation in the IGF. Now, NTIA is fully supportive and has been for years of the IGF. And we see that in not only in our engagement during the development process and the work of the multi-stakeholder advisory group, but also in our participation. So we'd like to have high-level participation. This year we had the Assistant Secretary speak during one of the main sessions. One thing that we noticed, though, is that where are the other high-level government participants at the IGF? Now, France, the host country, certainly demonstrated an exceptional level of participation. The head of state, of course, giving the speech. But one of the age-old questions that the IGF community asks itself is, how do we bring in more governments and more private sector so you can have more of a balanced and diverse engagement at the event? And so I think something that we've been thinking about is, how do you create value for those government stakeholders? So often we see some governments, for example, those that are highly represented at the ITU or at the Plenipot just aren't at the IGF, and the question is why. And of course, it harkens back to that fundamental difference between state multilateral decision-making and the power of governments alone to share making those decisions as opposed to the other stakeholders, all the technical community, academia, civil society, and private sector. So I think it's just everybody is focusing on that question now. How do you thread the needle between creating more value for the IGF, for governments, and offering them something that is of value that doesn't necessarily align with what is traditionally valuable, a negotiating exercise, for example. What are those outputs of the IGF that really can draw people in and be useful to all stakeholders? So that's one takeaway that NTIA is currently marinating on right now.
Hi, I'm Shane Tews. I'm the IGF-USA co-chair, and I attended both the IGF and ICANN, which Becky referenced, we haven't really talked about. I didn't attend Plenipot, but thank you to Samantha Dickinson's amazing Twitter sphere. If you guys don't follow her, you feel like you were in the room. I mean, until 4 a.m. in the morning, you're like, when did they sleep? You know, and it was fascinating. It really was like this sideshow of my life for 3 weeks. You know, just wondering what was going on and was it as crazy as it all sounded? And then I talked to so many people coming back, and it sounds like it was as crazy as it all sounded. So I'm going to say the one thing about IGF is it's a bit of a reflection and a wish list. Is we've got to get off the remedial 101. You go into these, you know, it always kind of reminds me a little bit of college. Like you would read the syllabus, and you're like, this is going to be a great class, and you go in and be like, this is not what I signed up for. So, like there was a conversation on internet governance or on IoT. Do we need to explain that to people that are at IGF? I think they have a pretty good concept of it. So there was this aspiration early on that we would get to topics and we would advance on them, and then eventually the idea was to not, as Becky pointed out, not to solve them at the IGF, but to move them to better places to participate. Is it a technical conversation? Is it a standards operation? Is it something that needs, industry best practices, that needs to bring in civil society to make sure that we're having a level set conversation about things? And we haven't really matured into that. So I'm hoping that we get there. I think weirdly, because of the French being so strong this year, to their credit, because we were a little bit worried that we were not going to have an IGF 2018, even though I love that Germany was willing to get in only if they could get the structure back. Like if we 19 and we can completely organize it, then we'll take that one. And I don't think it's a mistake that we're going from France to Germany, and so we all have to be a little bit cognizant of kind of, what's going on there. Let's say the word setup. So but for those who either participated in person or in this process, and we also go through this with IGF-USA. We had a person who joined us a couple of years ago, and she'd get a little frustrated with me in my co-chair position that I wasn't pushing the conversation forward. And I said, we will at some point if we need to, but sometimes people just need to get in the conversation amongst themselves and then progress forward. And we've had some really interesting dialogues because of that. We've had different ways to have the conversation. It's not always just a bunch of people yapping at an audience. It's getting more people engaged in it. And then Dustin did a really good job this summer of taking the conversation across the United States and going and trying to find more people to be inclusive and participatory in this. We are the seat of government here, so it's easy for us to want to be here because we have so many of the actual policy decision makers in the process, the lovely lady sitting next to me. But we're trying to make sure that we're including anybody who wants to be in this conversation. So if you know somebody who would like to engage in this conversation and doesn't feel like they've been invited to the party, they're invited. So make sure that you let them know that and then get them in touch with us if they'd like to have, a person to talk to.
Well, thanks, everyone. So I've got a series of questions to continue our dialogue. I'm going to tee up one person to start with an answer, but I'd love all of your input. Jane, I'm going to start with you. So we are at a point where we've surpassed 55% internet penetration around the globe. But we know we still have 3.5 million people, and that's a lot of people. Andrew said something during Intercommunity that is very important. There's a lot of people, especially that are new to the internet, that equate the internet with their platform, right? It's Facebook. They don't understand the distinction there. And that opens a whole host of questions about bias and data and privacy. So I'm curious to what you and other people had heard at these various events over the past 2 months. What are the compelling solutions around addressing access? Not necessarily the data and antitrust kind of angle of it, but what are the real solutions? Where should we have hope?
So, of course, I'm going to say community networks, but just another pitch, a little marketing. No, actually, I will turn to community networks as one way. It's not the magic bullet. It's not going to connect billions. But that model is pushing the margin on what needs to change now from a policy and regulatory perspective. A lot of the old infrastructure rules are out of date. Steve Song, who is a partner of ours and works with NSRC and APC and Mozilla, has this visual model of jars of rocks. And if you have a glass jar of big rocks, you can put medium-sized rocks and little rocks inside this jar, which for me signifies different layers of regulation and policy and thinking by governments. Again, private sector, we've got to start thinking outside the box. I've been doing this too long for us to take a look at the fact that people aren't connected. Rural, remote, and urban, people are not getting affordable access or access at all. So we can take a look at using community networks and different models. We've got to level up the conversation, as Shane is saying, not only with the companies that we work with, but the development banks and others who can put massive grants into infrastructure development, more opening up dark fiber. We're looking back now at the monopoly issues we dealt with years ago in '98. People are trying to retrench and close international gateways. It's amazing to watch. We saw this in Kyrgyzstan when we were working with them, both from an internet exchange point and community network perspective. Of course, I'm going to make a pitch for IXPs, another one of my favorite topics. But this is the grassroots work that we've been doing, which has scaled. Our colleague Machuki has this 80-20 by 2020, which is keeping 80% of African traffic in Africa by 2020, and we're getting there. We're now looking at not just megabits of traffic, but terabits being kept on the continent thanks to fiber being built out. If you don't know who Liquid Telecom is, take a look. They've been building terrestrial fiber. And I have a real issue with people just saying mobile's going to do it, because you still need terrestrial fiber if you're going to do research and build up your data centers. You can't have a data center with wireless. I mean, you can have some discussions in Wi-Fi for your staff, but if you're doing serious computing, which we have to take a look at this environment and say, what we have in some developed nations isn't always there yet in many developing countries, and that will come. But it's, back to your question, it's looking at how to amplify and magnify the discussion. So community networks wasn't something that people were talking about until they became the beach ball or the piñata maybe inside the room at the Plenipotentiary. So I think one of the things we have to do, and this goes back to the action plan that Andrew was talking about and the different work we're doing across the organization, work with our chapters, mobilize all of you to help us magnify those examples of what we can do and figure out where we can get those big infrastructure funders in as well and where we can change the game on regulation and policy. And it's really important we do that. Universal service, something I'm not a big fan of anymore because it's not working in many countries. It's corrupt in many places or broken. So what do we do to change that game? And that's where we have to level up the conversation. People like Katie, who's in the room, who's one of our policy people here in North America, they're taking a look at different net neutrality issues, working with Canada as well on IoT. So there are ways we can amplify what we're doing through all the partners here in the room. Thank you. And Marilyn, I want to give a shout out to Marilyn, who's been working with our Afghanistan chapter and talking to them about ways that they can look at infrastructure. These are micro conversations which we can scale to a meta level, but we've got to look at this strategically together, I think. This is the key thing for 2019.
So I'm not going to be able to talk about the stuff that Jane was talking about, but Jane and I worked 20 years ago on digital divide issues, and I have to say, the digital divide is alive and well in the United States. An hour outside of Washington, D.C., in Rappahannock County, most of the county doesn't have access to Wi-Fi, and even if it wasn't for research, it's too expensive to use. So I think, one of the things we ought to be thinking about is, just those old-fashioned rural, urban issues that we were talking about 20 years ago, they're still alive.
But Becky, I thought you bought that house out there because it didn't have Wi-Fi and you could get away from it.
Actually, I have really good Wi-Fi, but I'm probably the only person in the county that does.
You research that. I guess going back to the more of the macro issue and talking about the community networks, and one thing I guess I would caution on, and as we have this discussion at the international level, is not letting governments get very insular again in their thought process, which is, the one thing that we are realizing, especially after that raucous 2016 election, and we're learning that 18 might have been a little more raucous than we thought it was, is that, we've lost a certain level of trust depending on what it is that you are expecting from from the internet. And you're seeing a lot of corporations now going to what they call a zero trust model, that you have to completely identify yourself throughout the trust process. And we're struggling with this with a combination of, privacy and, how do you identify yourself? How many people have information that, we wish that they didn't because we were just freely giving away a lot of data that we didn't see as valuable. And so it's going to be easy for these international organizations to use those conversations and then go insular again. And I think we need to do our best to remind them that it's global connectivity we're looking for.
Right. I also think that it's critical that we keep engaging at the national level as well. I think that multilateral environments, international environments are important, but at the end of the day, it's a lot of the work of actually convincing national regulators, national governments that there are like alternatives for connectivity that might not necessarily be the ones that have been offered to them until different actors come to the table and offer like different solutions. I think that's a lot of the work that ISO has been doing, but I think we need to do more. I do think that community networks are a critical part of the solution, but I also think that we should encourage our community networks allies, the ones that are actually building the networks, to actually reach out to regulators and to educate them, because regulatory barriers are also there, and they make the life of community networks harder. And by changing regulation, we can also make it easier for non-profit entrepreneurs, but also for commercial small entrepreneurs to bring connectivity. And that's a part that I think that, especially in the Global South, we need to keep pushing, and we need more actors doing that. ISO has been doing a lot of it, but we need to bring more people to that conversation as well.
Thanks, everyone. Let's stay on that theme of the structure that works. So we can't have a discussion about IGF and not talk about the Macron speech, right? I think that was pretty fiery. A lot of people had a lot of different interpretations. I personally had a fantastically French experience. I was in the mezzanine in the second row. The media was in the row in front of me. And I'm listening and I'm working on my French and I'm trying not to read the translation, so I'm about 2 beats behind. But I knew when something fiery was said because I heard this chorus of in front of me. It's perfectly French, perfectly French. So open my eyes. What did he say? Did he say that? Yes, he said that. And obviously the chorus went deeper and more as the speech continued through the day. I'm curious now that a few weeks have set on it, is it as compelling and fiery as we thought when we were sitting in the room or we read it the next day? Personally, I'm still a little bit surprised about some of the discussions around content and liability and where he was going with that, and I don't quite understand where he was going. But I'm curious your thoughts and if anything is still sticking with you.
I'll just say something at the meta level because there are much more expert people in the organization who are parsing this than I am. But I would say I think the lack of understanding of the interwebs was something that came out, just what the architecture is. And this also struck me when Zuckerberg was speaking at right up here, Congress, that as a community we need to do a better job of educating our parliaments and our congresses and people we work with on a daily basis, like, our mothers and fathers and brothers and whatnot, about what the internet is. A lot of people don't know that submarine cables and satellites have something to do with this, or terrestrial fiber. They look at their phone, they look at their whatever device they have. So we've got a job to do there as the Internet Society, I think, and the community of interest, so that we then have this conversation that from the meta level where the politicians are actually working with us on what the solutions are. On the content side, I'll use the acronym now before anyone else says it, and then turn it to Becky. GDPR, and she knows that privacy was something I just duck and cover when I was at NTIA before. And now over to you.
Well, that was one of those things that somebody said that has DOG written all over it. I think that the thing that sticks out about it is that it's the same thing that Susan was saying about the lack of high-level government engagement, obviously not at the French level, but governments are not getting what they don't seem to, at least by their attendance, are not expressing that they're getting value out of these things. And I think part of that is because there is a lack of understanding about sort of what each of these different players in the ecosystem do. I mean, the thing that is astonishing to us in the ICANN debate about who is and GDPR is that a lot of the regulators actually thought that ICANN maintained a central database with all who is information. And it has taken months, literally months, to persuade people that that's not the model, and therefore you have to think about the sort of regulatory overlay in a different way. It's the same. It's they don't understand that submarine cables have something to do with it. The education for regulators is a critical piece, and part of that is educating regulators about where to go to get answers for things. And just on this point, I think you made the point that, there's the Macron speech and the paper from Berlin and all of that. And as I look back on it, I think one of the mistakes that we made in privacy, I will contrast to one of the things we did right, and by we now was talking about 20 years ago in the U.S. government. In 1998, the U.S. government put out a framework for global electronic commerce, and it talked about sort of what the vision was and what the pitfalls of overregulation were, and it really laid out a vision and a thought process and a context. We didn't do that with privacy. We thought we didn't need to. The Europeans went out and wrote that, and as everybody struggled globally to think about what does privacy mean and how do we do it on the internet, what was there but the directive? It was not. There wasn't another model to think about. There wasn't a contrast. There wasn't another vision. There wasn't a similar vision with a little more nuance in there. It was the directive, the data protection directive, or nothing. And the result of that was that many, many, many countries adopted that model. So I think that there is a grave danger in sort of not having a piece of paper with a vision that you can point to in this, because that's where people will end up. And if you don't have competing models to refine thought, you're going to get whatever is out there.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And I also think that, I think I disagree in something with Jane here. Like, we don't disagree much, but one thing, I think that the French government is fully aware of what they're saying. They just don't care, right? And that's the European approach. And I think we need to be aware that people might have different priorities. So like, we care about innovation. Maybe the Europeans don't. They care about privacy, and that's fine. But we need to find an argument that is like, okay, so they don't have the same priorities that we do. Okay, but then we also care about maintaining more or less a single internet. And I do think that for most consumers and for most people, the application layer is more important than the infrastructure layer. So, and at the application layer, we don't have a single internet. We haven't had it in like a long time anyway, and we should maybe stop saying that because it doesn't exist anymore, and probably won't exist, especially in this world and universe. I don't think that we want to convince the Chinese and the Russians to open the internet to our values, and we won't certainly do it according to theirs. So, but we do have a transatlantic internet. We do have an internet that's the same for the Americas, Europe, a big part of Asia. we need to come up with a better alternative. And part of it is like education and being, okay, this is what you can do, what you cannot do, this is how it works. And maybe that's a necessary part of it. We also need to be more imaginative. We need to come up with new ideas. We need to, I know, for example, when the European Parliament says that free flow of data should be paired with the protection of privacy, we cannot keep saying that that's an absurd idea. That's perfectly reasonable to accept that. Yeah, if you have free flows of data, we will have to accept that privacy should be protected of consumers. And we should also accept that the APEC privacy framework is going nowhere, so we need to have a better alternative. And that's fine. But we need to, unless we start doing the hard thinking and then uncomfortable thinking of like, well, maybe the thing that we thought was working for so many years is not working anymore, because the thing is that at the national level here, we're also debating a privacy law. We are like restricting what platforms can do regarding content. We are rethinking the limits of state surveillance. We keep talking about the power of internet platforms. So we are acknowledging actively, very actively, that there are like new problems that we have not solved. So it's like we need to use this debate as well to propose a new model, at least a new model is compatible with the European model. Because I think that the worst case scenario is like also splitting the transatlantic internet that we have.
So in terms of the IGF part of the speech, it did give us at least some cause for concern when we heard words of more multilateral IGF. And I understand that there could be language and translation difficulties, as Jane started the panel off with a reference back to Section 102 in Plenipot in 1998 that can kind of help color our understanding of what that might mean. But I think that it's when there were calls for more multilateral IGF, the IGF actually having a monitoring function about the progress of the call for trust and security in cyberspace throughout the year. I mean, that's just not what the IGF is. And so I think that's a challenge to proponents of the IGF to, again, find that way to demonstrate its value to governments. And there's plenty of value in the IGF. I mean, the IGF is a repository of, 12 years of discussion on internet governance and policy, including many of the folks in this room who've been there from the very beginning, but that's a massive trove of information. But again, it's really trying to find that value proposition and actually demonstrating how the outputs from the IGF can give value.
I don't have a lot to add to that, except for I think you were right. It was just a kind of the French are going to say what they're going to say and then screw everybody else and catch up, you know. And I do think one challenge we have, though, with government is that we get a lot of starting over from the beginning. So we don't always have people that are in this conversation from the, I mean, to have two people who've been doing this since 1998 is not the natural case for things in internet governance. We're pretty lucky. And so that's, to constantly have to bring everybody up to speed and make sure everybody's at the same part in the songbook is a constant challenge.
Let's talk a little bit about the intersection of media and content. There were several sessions at IGF that dealt with this. I think we can all agree that information spreads at the speed of light and disinformation fast, if not faster. It felt like a lot of the discussions oscillated between, the role of journalism, the role of monitoring, who has the ability to assess what content is, good and bad. On par, I'm curious to see what folks, their interpretations of this, were the debates largely on positions that were entrenched that people went into. Did anybody change? Do you think anybody came away with it learning, adopting a new position? And corollary to that, do you think that the discussion was more about the legal ramifications of implementing some sort of content change, or were they more focused on the risks of spreading misinformation?
So one thing I learned there that I didn't know, that was actually taking place here is that I think it's the Chicago Tribune has just decided they're not serving Europe anymore. They're just like, yeah, you know what, we're good. find another way around it, which kind of reminds us how, long ago it was actually Yahoo France who, we were like, we can't do that. We don't have any way of separating out, situations with the selling of Nazi paraphernalia. And then we kind of had to go, okay, well, we can. We don't want to. And because once we show people how to do that, we were very concerned about the bifurcation. And so I thought it was interesting to hear that from an invert where you had an American company that has said, I'd love to have been in that conversation where the lawyers were like, it could be expensive. And they're like, who cares? Like, we're just not going to serve them anymore. So it's going to be interesting to see, if others take that path or if there's a workaround that comes into place around that. So that was one interesting conversation that I was actually thought was pretty interesting. Another thing that has been going on at the IGF on content is local content. And actually, to the Motion Picture Association's credit, because they're usually kind of the challenge or the pariah in this conversation, is that they have gone out of their way to find local content creators talk about their challenges, especially in Africa. And this year they had a Nigerian woman who is doing a full feature film, and they actually sponsored her. So some of us got to see the entire movie. And while she was there, she also showed it at a Parisian film house 2 nights later. And I've been following her on Twitter, and it's always interesting because they just have such a. She went to school actually at the University of Michigan Film School, and they learn all about the great things that are available somewhere other than home, and then they try to import these things back to their native country. And she tried to use as much Nigerian film crews in what she was doing. And so that's kind of a flip side of the coin that is a different discussion, and how a lot of times they use the internet as their medium to get their content out because it's the only way for them. They can't get past the barrier. They don't have a lot of big film or movie houses there that are willing to show local content because they don't think it's an affordable way of doing business.
I'm going to harken back to when I used to live in the former Soviet republics for a minute. Scare you guys. I lived in Moldova and Armenia and was working to create regulators and do policy, but also quietly help support people who are trying to build ISPs and whatnot. Let's not forget that governments have been shutting down content streams for decades. When there is a coup or a revolution, poof, what goes down first and what gets taken over first? So that's something we have to think about. We have a challenge in Cameroon. We're very strong supporters of not shutting down the interwebs and government control of that. So I think the question for all of us is, where do we stand on that? How do we deal with that in the messaging going forward and other? And I was also thinking when Shane was speaking and going back to some of the days and at Commerce was audiovisual content was something that was a fight in the WTO. All the content mechanisms that were, so discs, people were CD-ROM, they were fighting that way back in the day as far as distribution and content. So this isn't a new discussion, but how do we deal with it now in the new medium, in the new era? Fake news and all that sort of business. A lot of the news that I was parsing when I was living overseas was you had to read through it. You knew that it wasn't fully trustable. But where does that trust mechanism come in with content now?
There we go. It seems like an undercurrent in all of these events is some level of dissatisfaction is expressed with multi-stakeholderism and a multi-stakeholder form of government, which on the surface seems a little counterintuitive because all these people have come together from around the world to achieve some really laudable goals. So I'm curious if there were examples that you've seen at any of these events over the last couple of months that really stand out as a great example that the model is working and that it should continue. I'm going to start with Susan.
Sure. Well, I think that there's a lot of, I'm still very hopeful, and there's a lot of opportunity there. to kind of thread this needle that we've been discussing. And just to kind of sum up a few themes that I've gathered during this panel, there should be kind of a rebooting of that traditional kind of bifurcated multilateral, multi-stakeholder model. There are plenty of opportunities to take some really good work that's done kind of at the hyper-local and micro level and put that up to the meta and international level. And I think there's also been some questions about, identifying venues and being able to create venues that address various needs for people. And I'm sure the next panel will address that. And so I think that one instance that I liked without putting too much pressure on myself is the example of the dynamic coalition. So we had just started, NTIA's worked with Afilias and VeriSign to start a dynamic coalition on DNS issues at the IGF. And so we're hoping that in our first year we'll be focusing on universal acceptance issues. And the aim is really to create, in a multi-stakeholder environment, building upon the connections and the networks at the IGF, is to really create useful guidance and through networking and connections to help governments and business understand how they can increase universal acceptance. So if we're successful, which I really hope we will be, I think we're hoping that that can be an instance of a multi-stakeholder output that does come from the IGF, that does demonstrate the value of the IGF.
There we go. And sorry, I'm going to show a little bias here for our newest dynamic coalition and talk just a few minutes more. But one of the things that was fantastic, we had our first formal meeting, and we had such a great cross-section of attendees. And I come away from that saying that we've got a diverse set of goals and deliverables through this year. And I see we've got technologists, policy experts, people with marketing and product and all these various backgrounds. And it makes me feel better, and it made me feel that this was the right place to do this sort of work. And it is a great continuation of what was started at ICANN with the Universal Acceptance Steering Group. And it's a great evolution. So I think we'll do well, Susan.
So just on the, I think it's a mistake to talk about the multi-stakeholder model, because I think that there are many multi-stakeholder models. So I'll just talk about an example of the ICANN multi-stakeholder model, and I think the transition from U.S. government contract was an example of a multi-stakeholder process working very, very well. It was hard work and it was long work. I know a lot of people in the audience who spent much time, and Andrew and I talked past each other for a while, but we got it done. I think that was an example of a process that worked, and it actually I think contributed a lot of strength to the community. Having said that, I think there is a lot of concern. The board has identified evolution of ICANN's multi-stakeholder model, scaling it in a way so that it can continue to be effective, so that people are properly incentivized, stakeholders are properly incentivized to come together and make decisions, find solutions, as opposed to stand in corners and espouse their particular view of the world. We think that's one of the biggest challenges that ICANN is facing, and it's we've made it a conscious priority for the organization to think about how the ICANN multi-stakeholder model scales and continues to actually drive solutions where consensus policy is needed.
I would just simply say one thing about the multi-stakeholder model has worked. Why would we have so much pushback at the plenipotentiary? And so that's just one point. And the second point I'll raise is that we have used the Internet Governance Forum as a way to bring together community networks. And it kicked off in 2016 in Guadalajara. It was amazing to see the energy in the place. And that energy is still grown. And this is what we call the person-to-person connections, where you can, of course, talk to each other on Zoom or a Skype chat, but when you come together, the energy is amazing. And I think what we've also proven to some of the community networks is that there is a model for them to work with other players, the Internet Society, APC, to help scale what they're doing. Because if you're in a grassroots movement and you're coming together as grassroots organizations, it's building the trust. I call them human trust networks. You have to have people trust, person-to-person trust, whether it's cybersecurity, IoT, but we need that place where we can come together. We may not always use the Internet Governance Forum moving forward because it may have had its day in some ways for us on the community network side, but it was a place where we brought people together. So that's really important to think about with other movements. Yeah.
I would also add that, and I agree with Jane and both Becky and Susan. I think also that the fact that we should think, would the world be better if we wouldn't have something like the IGF or multi-stakeholder environments? And the answer is no, because they help to diffuse conflict, they help to create positive synergies, they help to think new ways of regulation, or no ways of not regulating but governing, and so on. And I think that's why we should make an effort to rethink them and to make them more effective, more useful, and to. I think that it would be good to get out of an IGF, not thinking that, oh my God, that was so frustrating, but thinking, oh, that was a great investment of my time. And I think that not always we can say that. And I think that's reason to keep working, but I think that it has a lot of positive value, and that's reasons to keep thinking of how to strengthen them. At the same time, especially, and this has to do a lot with, especially it's an important message for civil society and academia. We need to be cognizant that that's not necessarily where decisions are being taken. That going to the IGF does not substitute engaging with your national government. Does not replace going and finding ways to influence the ITU or the WTO. And I think a lot of the frustration from civil society comes from that. From thinking that, oh, but if we have the Internet Governance Forum, how come decisions are not being taken here? And it's true, some decisions should be taken there, but they're not. So we need to find ways to keep shaping the governance of the Internet there where the governance of the Internet is being shaped. And I think that's a lesson that the private sector knows, that governments, of course, know, and that civil society is still struggling to understand. But I think that's the thing that we need to combine. First, making sure that everyone knows that decisions are going to be taken elsewhere, and that the IGF needs to be, and all the multi-stakeholder environments should be strengthened as well.
I would just recommend, I think it was Mike Silver in his departure speech off the board said that he was concerned that it had gotten a little tribal. And, we're seeing that in some of these issues where I'm getting the acronym soup, but you see certain groups of people that come in with their point of view and all they're there to do is proselytize and not listen. And that was not the point of this process. It was to get beyond that and have the dialogues. You may still feel you're strongly about your point of view, but the point is not to arrive entrenched. It is to arrive and have a dialogue.
I'm going to pose one more question to our panel, but I want to give you a heads up that you'll have an opportunity to ask questions after this next round. So my final question, it is a Plenipot question, but I don't think anybody needed to be there to answer the question. It had to deal with the numerous discussions and items that were placed in front of the group around OTT, over-the-top services, things like Netflix. There were also a number of discussions around emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. There was some language adopted. I don't think we need to know what the language is to have a discussion of where do we really think those next discussions are going to happen, and where's the real work going to happen in these emerging technologies, things like artificial intelligence. Is this with the technologist more than it is the regulators?
Sorry.
Yes.
I think that as much as we would want it to be with the technologies, it's going to happen with the regulators. It's going to happen with the governments. Governments are concerned. That's what we saw in the Plenipot. They're going to go ahead and do their thing. I think we were successful in the Plenipot of not giving the ITU an extensive mandate to work on AI, but there's no way of stopping other governments to do that at the national level. On OTTs, the mandate was pretty narrow. It's like basically recognizing what the ITU has already been doing for the last years, and I think it's a pretty good outcome. That won't stop other governments from like imposing new regulations on OTTs. And I think it's about having the political conversation. The political conversation that has to be substantiated with technical arguments and technology arguments. But it's the WTO is discussing like e-commerce rules, and that's a purely trade negotiation, and it's gonna be about how much money I'm gonna get out of this, and it's gonna be very hard. And maybe it's not gonna be like that for the U.S. negotiators, not for the European ones. Latin American ones, how many people are they gonna have being super concerned about digital issues? Very few, and they're gonna decide anyway.
I think we're going to have to start helping drive the conversation, and I don't mean necessarily the Internet Society on AI, but collectively as a community, we've got to start thinking about what, as Becky, you said, what's our answer? In 1998, a man named Bangaman put out a paper, and the US government's response was the Framework for Global Electronic Commerce, which set the tone for almost 10 to 15 years. So what's our answer now as a community? Maybe not just as having the government put something out, but what would we do? I'd also just posit that when you look at Boston Robotics and see those dogs, which are now like parkour guy, I was, holy smokes, you mean, can it sense me if I was in a field and it was going to stomp on me? We have companies building amazing, crazy technology, which of course different sectors are going to start to use. So do we regulate it? Do we not regulate it? I mean, we've had these conversations before, but where is that the heart of the conversation, and do we start to figure out, is it another tab D, a transatlantic business dialogue through the OECD from a business perspective? And obviously in the ITU, governments are going to talk about these issues. So what is our answer? And we have some answers at the Internet Society. We do participate in ITU-D, and we're going to hit it hard on community networks. And I'm going to drag Gus kicking and screaming with me and some others, because civil society was excellent at the Plenipotentiary. And many people were afraid of how this might turn out. But we came together, and I think that's where, with the internet community, we've got to be stronger as a community. ICANN, ISOC, IETF. Let's not forget where the standards are being developed for the interwebs, too. Like, how do we talk about these issues at a level that people can understand so there isn't the fear factor? Because we saw a lot of fear. There were just some random conversations about what ICANN was, what they did, and Internet Society, and what we were pushing. And so you have to engage. If you don't engage, then someone else is going to drive the conversation.
And hopefully we engage in a way that provokes thought and the what if. I think that's the critical. So the other piece of this that Jane left out in the Bangaman thing was that some lender in Germany had passed a digital signature law that essentially adopted a technology in 1998. And it was crazy. And meanwhile, all of the notaries all over Spain were running around trying to figure out how to be the digital signature repository. And so if people hadn't been saying, whoa, if you do this, you know, what about this? What about that? Why not this technology? Why is that better? Why is that if we hadn't been out there advocating thought and dialogue, we could have ended up with a much worse. I mean, I think what was important about the Framework for Global Electronic Commerce was that it promoted a robust dialogue rather than, sort of forceful action. The one area where we acted sort of precipitously in the United States was children's privacy. And I don't think there's a person in the world who thinks that the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act is a useful piece of legislation. I don't know. I'm sure some people can't speak to that point. But it's, I mean, you know, it collectively taught parents how to teach their children how to lie. That's what the regulation did.
Going back to your East sign, I think about ATMs, and for those of us who are old enough to watch the advent of the ATM, it was a trust factor. You had to go like, well, I'm gonna punch a number in, but only and remember there were like segments. So you had to look for like some Cirrus or whatever that was, and eventually the trust went across, and so we learned that there were ways to do this, and the technology actually was trustworthy. I worry that we're going to try to future-proof on something like AI that's going to be damning to the capability, and this actually goes a bit back to, and I don't think this is in any way was a thought into GDPR, but it's a good point of saying you have to give room for there to be the ability to expand. So the whole idea of having the disintermediated privacy that you can give people by not always associating the PII with the actual data will allow us to do machine learning and AI, but we have to make sure that we keep our regulators cognizant of those opportunities and those opportunities lost when you do something like we just did with the California legislation, which I don't think it was meaning to do any harm, but it's going to take a lot of workaround or possibly national legislation if we do it right. Kind of doubt that, but hopeful.
Great, thanks everyone. Any questions from the audience? Here, I'm going to bring the mic to you.
Hi, it's Judith Helsing. I also like the question. I also was at Plenipot like the others. And I think, especially with regarding as OTT and AI and others, is that one, we also need to work with the governments, the regulators, and other stuff, in explaining about OTT and what it could do for them and how it can work to their advantages, and also working with them on the climate of innovation in each of the countries, and to help them understand that OTT is not a threat, that it could help reinvigorate economies and grow economies. And I think that also needs the conversation we had. We also want to show that OTTs are not something that can be should be looked upon as another way they can get taxes or a cash cow or something like that. But how can we innovate, and how can they get other countries and get the regulators to understand that it's more of a climate of innovation, and how do we promote innovation instead of stifling innovation? And as for why are these coming up in the ITU, also I think we need to also refocus discussion on what the ITU does, what's the mandate of it, and maybe other groups have a bet since OTTs and AI span so many different sectors, why another maybe UN agency is a better place for that as to being the home. The whole discussions in Plenipot on AI were more in the sense of like, well, AI is in so many sectors. We're not touching about agriculture. We're not touching about health. We're not touching about any of those. The ITU has no mandate in those. So we have to really work and figure out which sector which UN group is really handling that, and then push the capacity building on that UN group to really bring out the focus and get everyone talking about that, so that it won't be seen as the ITU be doing it, but it will be some other UN organization who has the mandate for that.
Judith, there's one thing I would say to that is that we have a huge opportunity with Doreen Bogdan, who, congratulations to industry, government, and everyone that got her elected. That was huge. I've known Doreen since 1998. She was one of the driving forces in the D sector way back. She's the person that started the regulatory stuff at ITUD. She started the Global Symposium for Regulators. She's an amazing person. We now have this woman, after 153 years, go team, who's been elected, who wants to be a partner. We work with her in the Equals Coalition. We also have worked with her across different issues. I think we have an incredible opportunity to shift the conversation, bring the ITU in if we can, with her, through her, to talk more about community networks. I'm hearing that other governments and the team in Latin America from the ITU space want to work with us, and any of you. So the question is, let's change that dialogue. We can't just sit around and say, gosh, we can't talk about it in the ITU. You have a really good point, though, Judith, on other UN agencies. Let's talk to UNCTAD. Trade is not going away. The WTO is going to heat back up at some point in time. Let's not forget that they used to deal with this basic versus value-added services, which was regulated versus unregulated. People are going to start to take a look at different issues, and we need to be on the ball with what that is. But we've got to help move that dialogue, I think, more.
Thanks. My name is Marilyn Cade. I'm going to follow up on that comment, but I'm going to open my comment by looking around the room and reminding us that we actually learned this lesson in 1995, 1996, 1998, when we had to saddle up and go to the Hill and teach our parliamentarians about what the internet was, being one of the people who actually taught members of Congress how to use email. I am serious. We need to think differently about how we reach policymakers and understand that not every country has a advisory group that focuses on the benefits of technology. Perhaps more could if we gave some thought to developing champions at a national level. And I'm going to, my drum is called the National IGF Initiatives. I'm just going to promote our thinking about the fact that that is a way to actually reach the national policymakers. And I hope we'll start using the term differently, not just use the term regulator, but also use the term policymaker, because many of the policies that we care about are actually made in the ministries, in multiple ministries that today do not meet horizontally. So there's a couple of things that we might think about that we may be able to share some ideas and look ahead. I also, though, want to really promote this last point that Judith referenced and also Jane referenced. I think most of us are familiar with the ITU, but not familiar with UNESCO's work. UNESCO owns the responsibility for content and ethics. Most of us don't really understand UNCTAD, but we have a very, very friendly Secretary General there who is really vitalizing the engagement with e-commerce week and reaching, it's called e-commerce for all, reaching SMEs in developing countries. So if we start thinking about what we can do to leverage some of those others, I have one more favorite, and that is the Commission on Science and Technology for Development. That commission, which may not seem very powerful, brings together the science and technology ministers, and they are always friendly to the interest that we have and very, very accessible during the CSTD meetings. So my go-to plan would be for us to look more seriously, and the U.S. is a member, the U.S. government is a member of CSTD, but look more seriously about how we might harness some different horses.
Any questions over here?
John Curran, CEO, American Registry for Internet Numbers. We're a long-time IGF-USA sponsor and ISOC sponsor, and have been around a while. I've done this for a while. So the question that comes up, and I guess I'd want to know from the panel, is coming out of this IGF, from everything you read, I was not there. I managed to pass out and instead have Samantha Dickinson join our delegation to Plenipot to watch that and send people to IGF. So I watched all the Twitter feeds. But coming out of both, it would seem that there was a sea change, that there was a real question of where the IGF goes going forward. And I'd ask the panel, we've had a very successful cooperation, multi-stakeholder engagement in civil society, technical society, some aspects, some governments, regulators and policymakers for decades. But we also know governments have at their disposal more multilateral, treaty-based form to use. The question is, if you're a government, how do we make IGF look like part of the framework for a solution? When you have a problem, because governments now are dealing with something that isn't 2% of their economy, it's 20% of their economy. It affects so many more citizens. When you have an issue that's rooted in the internet, how do we depict the fact that working in IGF to discuss it is a step on a road to somewhere and not a diversion? Because from the feedback I get, it's not clear governments see it as a step in a framework that leads somewhere. Is there a way to change that?
Well, thank you for that question. So I guess the first thing I would suggest is we should all encourage governments to submit to the consultation that is open right now for the IGF until mid-January. It's the first place to start. And then I think that having the benefit of an actual date, albeit it is over Thanksgiving, for the IGF 2019 in Berlin, that certainty will enable us to plan and better find a way to accommodate exactly the what you've expressed, John, because that is, I think all of this, some governments use the stronger word in this current discussion of reform at the moment, but I think we do see a sea change, and a lot of the work of the multi-stakeholder advisory group and the community writ large is going to be focusing on making those improvements, building on the momentum of that sea change and trying to manifest in something for Berlin in 2019.
So Denmark sent 4 people. One of them used to be our former GAC rep, Julia, was there, and her boss. And the reason why she was there is because her counterpart was at Plenipot. But they are looking to do a much more open forum, use transparency. They were there to figure out how do we use these tool sets and looking for the experts to talk to. So I think part of what we need to do is keep sending the experts to IGF. I think that's important that we get a reputation, continue the reputation on that. You know, she was asking me who to go talk to because they want to be the guiding point. They're also doing this with .de on privacy. You know, it's just that. So you're seeing sometimes because it's maybe a small, you know, they're a smaller country. They have less people to argue with. They can figure this stuff out. But they're trying to be engaged in the multi-stakeholder process as well as learning from that and then utilizing those lessons back at home.
I think it's important, and you know, a lot of this falls to the MAG, but I think telling the story more in a more compelling way from beginning to end, sort of what's the theme, what's coming out, building the workshops and sessions to build on a theme and a story, I think is going to make a lot of difference. And I was struggled because I thought that it was, at least part of this was the physical layout this time, but it felt like a lot of separate, siloed, unrelated things. And I think telling a story more holistically is going to help governments understand what they might get out of it.
I think that there's also like a low-hanging fruit fix is that many developing countries cannot afford to send people to these places, and it's up to developed countries to decide if we are to sustain these institutions and these places functioning. We need to find ways to bring these government officials, because having people from the embassies represent their countries, it's the same as having nothing, because the people from the embassies don't have the substantive expertise. They don't always report back to capital on the substance of the conversation. They're not qualified for taking any decisions or taking any stance, actually. So that's something to keep in mind. That, for example, I was in the Freedom Online Coalition conference in Berlin, and Argentina used to be. I'm Argentine. Argentina used to be friend of the chair, and this time they decided not to be any longer the friend of the chair, and they didn't even fly. to Berlin because they cannot afford it. So if we want to keep these places functioning, then we need to also like use some money and spend some money in bringing at least the key allies in the Global South to the conference, because otherwise, obviously, it won't have any value for them because they don't even go there.
Just to riff off that point with developing countries, we do at least have a date, as Susan said, and that's important because this is where the visa issues, and we've got to impose upon the offices of the good offices of our government colleagues to impress upon the German government to start that process early, which would mean also from an ISOC perspective is strategic mobilization of our community. We have chapters, many of you here, we have people all over the world who care about this issue. Maybe a survey to figure out where we're coming from and what they think. So I guess stay tuned, we'll figure that out, but it's important that we take a look at how to mobilize as a community.
Well, I think ending our discussion here on inclusivity and the work that we have ahead of us is a great way to bring this panel to a close. I want to thank Jane and Becky, Gus, Susan, and Shane, and thank all of you today. Thank you.